So today's topic is the business case for thriving organizational culture, which is all about performance leadership. The performance leadership pillar is all about achieving real results and maximizing the talent within your organization. And this means working towards clear goals for the future and ensuring that they are actually achieved. And so it's important to take leadership seriously and be willing to experiment, implement improvements, and make adjustments as needed. Performance management, therefore, is crucial in this regard. Monitoring, measuring, and reflecting on results and linking concrete actions and measures to these results. So for today's discussion, we're joined by Dr. George Woods for his presentation, followed by the reflections of Pierre-Yves Robert. I'll speak a little bit more about Dr. George Woods for those of you that have not met him before or attended one of his sessions. Dr. Woods is the CEO of the Culture Architects, a systems thinking, C-suite executive and organizational transformation strategist with over 30 years of cross-sector leadership across financial services, healthcare, social enterprise, and humanitarian organizations. He has led major strategic, cultural, and operational change initiatives for global institutions, including HSBC, Deutsche Bank, EY, Nedbank, and St. John Ambulance. His work focuses on building high-performing cultures, enabling organizational resilience, and driving sustainable growth. And so Dr. Woods also lectures in leadership and strategy and serves as an academic tutor at Business School Netherlands. And he actively contributes to social impact through board service and leadership mentoring across the UK and Africa. We're also joined by Pierre-Yves Robert, who is our reflector, and as the co-founder and managing partner of the Culture Architects, he's also an accomplished C-suite leader, non-executive director, and business coach with extensive experience across South Africa and the UK. He specializes in organizational culture, strategic alignment, transformation, and sustainable growth for startups, scale-ups, and established enterprises. Pierre has served on multiple boards, including as chair, strengthening governance and decision-making frameworks. And he's also a tutor with Business School Netherlands, supporting leadership and strategic management development. He's passionate about people and culture and helps organizations build collaborative teams that drive meaningful, lasting change. And with that said, Dr. Woods, over to you.
Thank you, Jean. And just confirming you can see the presentation.
We can, thank you.
Okay, fabulous. Well, folks, good morning, and a real privilege to be with you, coming to you from the Cambridgeshire area. It's a glorious spring day here today, so we're feeling full of the joys of spring, as it were. We're going to make a case today, not just for better culture, but for culture as the central strategic asset of any organization that wants to thrive. And so we're going to allow some case studies, and then have an opportunity to reflect together. So if we just look ahead, so why culture is the strategic imperative? And I think in previous conversations, we've certainly established the importance of culture, good organizational culture, thriving organizational culture. But I think it's important that we frame this in the context that 70% of change programs fail due to cultural misalignment. You might go, that's an extraordinarily high number, but it is absolutely academically based. Now, you juxtapose that in a world of accelerated technology. So we know that we're now in a space of rapid evolution of AI, digital transformation. We're also in a global context that is somewhat unstable. And I think I'm sort of understating that, but it is an unstable context. Think then what culture as a differentiator does. Okay, and so if you think, organizations where this has been monitored and measured, 3 to 4 times higher returns in culturally healthy firms. Whereas organizations that are not healthy and thriving, culturally speaking, don't have the resilient backbone that you would expect. Now, think of the cultural context. think of the global context, think of a world of emerging technologies. What is your key differentiator here? What builds thriving cultures? 88% of executives rank culture as a critical business driver. And you'll see in these slides, and again, very happy to share the slides after the fact, we have gone for real sound academic base here. Now, we've said this before, that the comment is attributed to Peter Drucker that says, culture eats strategy for breakfast. Without healthy cultural foundations, even the most elegant organizational strategies will fail at the point of execution. And we've said this before, but you can have the greatest strategy in the world, but if your culture is unhealthy, if people are unhappy, that's sort of real Maslow's hierarchy of needs, where people live in survival mode only and not that self-actualizing organization. In other words, doing just enough. And we introduced a concept some time ago around discretionary energy. In other words, giving more because you're happy and in a thriving environment rather than just enough to get the job done. So financial performance in healthy, thriving organizations. We're going to do a few case studies today. Or indeed, organizations that are healthy and thriving are also highly innovative, and that sort of front line innovation, those who are customer facing, who are empowered to make decisions in thriving organizations. And of course, that sort of links directly to financial performance, or indeed talent and retention. So the Gallup poll of 2023 finds highly engaged, culture-rich workplace achieves 43% lower staff turnover and 23% higher profitability. These are just facts, absolute facts, and they come from the basis of thriving organizational culture. Or indeed resilience and adaptability. You know, you will recall from previous conversations, and we'll share the model with you again today. In previous conversations, we've spoken about navigating the pandemic together, and can you believe it, we're nearly sort of 6 years in from that place. But organizations that went into the pandemic that had good, healthy, resilient cultures thrived. Okay, were able to pivot really, really quickly, and those who didn't battled. Okay, we've shared before a model that we've co-developed with the business school, where purpose is at the heart of the organization, and culture is one of the key enablers. And we've called this model the modus quantum model. In other words, the mode of operating and sort of that idea of quantum physics, that idea of radiating out good, healthy, thriving organizations. And they're organizations where innovation is key, where brand is coherent with culture and culture is coherent with purpose. And collaboration is one of those sort of key outcomes. So we thought we would just remind you of that model. We also shared with you before that culture can be diagnosed. Okay, you can understand what your current culture looks like, why it is the way it is. You can then look forward and you can ideate. In other words, what kind of culture do you want? And you might recall that we've spoken about macro and micro cultures. So at a macro cultural level, leadership-led, board-led, strategy-led, but at a micro level, how do I, as a leader, enable good and healthy, thriving culture within my team? So understand what the culture is. Understand what works about the culture, what doesn't work about the culture. Then define how you create a thriving culture. What is the gap between what your organizational culture is versus the culture you want? Then co-creating a thriving and vibrant culture. Understanding the limiting behaviors, understanding which values hold your culture back, which values advance your culture. And of course, as in all things, whatever gets measured gets managed. So how do you measure and continually refine? And so we see this as part of a consulting framework of ideate, implement, and iterate. It is something that you can keep working on. What am I trying to say to you today is that you can consciously create good culture, but it takes conscious decision and it takes leadership buy-in at the highest levels. The evidence of healthy cultures. So Cotter and Heskett did a piece of work in 1992. Now, granted, a long, long time ago, but at that point they found 682% revenue growth over 11 years. And these were cultures that were strong versus culture weak firms, or indeed a more recent Gallup poll that established 23% higher profitability for higher engaged teams and 43% lower staff turnover. Or indeed McKinsey in 2021. 36% of organizations that have healthy and thriving cultures are more likely to outperform on profitability for top quartile diverse firms. Or Edmondson in 1999 that said, 3 times returns from more innovative solutions from psychologically safe teams. And we'll explore a little bit about what we mean about psychologically safe. So several case studies we want to share with you today. So Microsoft. 2014, Microsoft faced deep cultural internal dysfunction. Okay, and I want you to reflect honestly about your own organization. So siloed departments, internal competition, a know-it-all fixed mindset that stifled innovation and eroded market leadership in mobile and cloud computing. Well, forecast ahead, look to where we are today in terms of Microsoft and look to where they're heading. So the challenge was they had fixed mindset, a culture that rewarded knowing over learning, stack ranking, pitted employees against each other. In other words, created a highly competitive but unhealthy competitive position within the organization. Innovation was stifled, and of course there was a talent exodus to competitors, and the market cap was stagnant at around $300 billion in 2013. The intervention, so the CEO, Satya Nadella, introduced Dweck's growth mindset as the cultural North Star. And I think I want to just highlight for a moment, and I'm sure Pierre will pick up on this as well in his reflection, that it took Nadella's leadership as chief exec to bring the organization together. And I think that's really, really important. Culture is something that is led from the top, but it is something that filters right through the organization. Yeah. Abolished stack ranking and introduced Connect's feedback model. In other words, understanding that we are reliant on each other as an ecosystem within an organization. They launched One Microsoft to break down silos, and leaders were trained in empathy, curiosity, and learning agility. And I want to just draw out empathy. Empathy is such an important aspect in organizational culture. In other words, understanding we are all different human beings. Together we can achieve so much more, but there needs to be empathy for each other. So what was the outcome? The outcome was market gap capitalization grew to $3 trillion by 2024. Juxtapose that against the $300 billion in 2013. Azure Cloud became the second globally behind AWS. Employee engagement scores rose significantly, and they acquired LinkedIn, Activization, Blizzard, GitHub, etc. Important, all culture-led organizations. Another case study, Google. And this is around psychological safety. So Google's context, 2012 to 2015, Project Aristotle studied 180 teams to understand what made best teams effective. And the findings have fundamentally reshaped the understanding of team culture and performance. And psychological safety was key, right up there. Team members who feel safe take risks and are vulnerable with each other. The single strongest predictor of team performance. Think about the organizations you're in and the kind of psychological safety that's created within those organizations. In other words, where it is safe to make mistakes, it is safe to fail fast, learn from those, and develop from there. Dependability. So members reliably complete quality work on time. Okay, and they're dependable. It becomes a core value of the organization. Structure and clarity, clear goals, roles, and execution plans for every team member. And of course, that goes hand in hand with Jean's sort of opening remarks around key performance management. Meaning, work is personally meaningful. It connects to values and purpose and impact. The work matters and creates visible change in the world. Pierre, I think you will agree, and we'll explore that in your reflections. But we need to know why we do what we do. We need to know why it matters. And if you think back to the model we shared with you earlier, purpose right in the center of the organization. I thought I'd also bring NHS England, seeing as I'm here in England, the National Health Service. And this was based on a report in 2013 where there was a real risk to patient safety and indeed the staff distress within the National Health Service. And so there was a culture of fear, which suppressed staff from raising concerns on patient safety, targets and metrics to precedence over compassionate care. Okay, when you become overtly measurement focused and not people centric, okay, that's the balance you strike here. Leadership was focused on finances, not cultures or values. There was board level disengagement and from frontline reality, which created a values gap. In other words, where your board of trustees are so far removed from what's actually happening on the ground, okay, and neither the twain shall meet. And worst of all, there's a bullying culture which led to high staff turnover and reduced care quality. Well, there were interventions. And the cultural response and outcomes, the NHS improvement introduced developing people and improving care framework. Psychological safety, where did you hear that before? Okay, you heard it in previous case studies. Speaking up and a culture embedded in leadership standards. Staff surveys became a key performance metric at board level. And culture change led to measurable improvement in the Care Quality Commission ratings. That's one of the regulatory bodies. And trust with top quartile staff engagement showed 4 times fewer serious incidents. In other words, where you've created psychological safety and an organization where people thrive, they care more. Okay, that's really, really important. We've used words like empathy, but care. Okay, I really, really genuinely care about the organization I'm working with. Patagonia, and just another case study, and mindful of time, so we're going to canter through this. So Patagonia consistently cited as a benchmark case in purpose-driven culture. Remember, purpose at the center of the organization, the why we do what we do. So the cultural values, as an example, is we're in business to save our home planet. Employees were empowered to pursue environmental activism on company time. Flat hierarchy, radical transparency in decision-making, and something that was quite novel at the time was on-site childcare and flexible hours. Well, of course, the world has moved on significantly since then. People practices, voluntary turnover, 4% versus industry average of 13%. 91% of employees say Patagonia is a great place to work. New hires self-select based on values, reducing cultural misfit. In other words, develop the organization you want, build the culture you want, and recruit accordingly. If that makes sense. So find that coherence and that match. In other words, this is who we are. Recruit on that basis. Doesn't mean recruit like-minded people in all instances, but it does mean that there's a central tenet of core values about how we behave as an organization. Commercial outcomes revenue exceeded $1 billion without external investment. Anti-consumerism campaigns increased by 30%. Shuna transferred ownership to Climate Trust, so the brand value surged, and they were consistently ranked top employee in the outdoor retail sector. And then the final case study, just around financial services, and this is around banks. And the FCA identified poor culture as a primary driver of conduct failures. In other words, really poor behavior in banking. And so this was of major concern to the FCA. But organizations, in this instance, financial services, with psychological safety reported misconduct 40% more quickly, enabling faster remediation. Culture surveys that correlated with Net Promoter Score, and they conducted outcomes and staff sickness rates. So what was the outcome? The outcome was 68% reduction in conduct incidents. Higher customer retention in banks, rated in the top quartile for culture. Estimated annual cost of poor culture in the United Kingdom alone in the financial services, according to PwC in 2019, was £2.1 billion. Top 10% culture healthy banks showed return on equity constantly in the sector top decile. So if we just cross-case synthesis very briefly, so if you look at the organizations we've just reviewed, so culture driver in Microsoft, growth mindset, Google, psychological safety, National Health Service, compassionate leadership, purpose and sustainability in Patagonia, and financial services was values and conduct. The primary tools were leadership behavior, team design, staff engagement surveys, hiring and autonomy, and of course, creating a framework in the financial services industry. Key outcomes was 10 times market capitalization for Microsoft. Remember that case study. Okay. Google, best teams, NHS, safer outcomes, Patagonia, 1 billion in revenue, and in the financial services, 68% fewer incidents. And what we've done is we've built some academic anchors for you as well, so that you can go back and actually look at the research that we have generated. So bringing it all together as we draw this to a close, we've created a infographic of all of the elements that we've discussed today, which again, very, very happy to share with you. But what we've tried to establish for you is the business case for thriving organizational culture. And at its heart is the mission and the purpose, the kind of culture that you intentionally create, the top level engagement, and how that filters throughout the organization. But I think it's safe to say, just on the few case studies that we shared with you, healthy, thriving organizational culture is a must. It is a strategic imperative. That is probably the most important thing you can do. You can have the greatest strategy in the world, but if your culture is not vibrant and thriving, you're on a road to nowhere. Key references, so just to share with you, so some of the academic groundedness in it all, before Pierre comes in to reflect. I think just to say that together with Business School Netherlands, we have been co-creating masterclasses specifically centered on culture, and more of that is available on the website. Thanks, Pierre.
Thanks, George. Love the infographic you slipped in right at the end there.
Right at the end.
Right at the end. So as always, such a compelling subject, and look forward to the conversation. I'll try and leave time for questions at the end because I know we're short of time. So I think it's still alarming, and this was pretty much the first stat that you put up there, that despite the passage of time and the fact that the 70% failure rate around strategic initiatives and in any kind of change initiative actually still holds true from the first years that I think the sort of meta studies around this were conducted in the 90s, and we're now almost in the mid 2020s, and we're still struggling with this. And that I think is quite scary given where the world is now. Of course, a big part of that, I think, and it's an unseen cost, and it kind of picks up on that 2.1 billion pound cost that you referenced right at the end there from PwC about the cost to the UK economy. But a lot of that, I imagine, is unseen cost of turnover. People just leaving the business and going elsewhere, right? And we've all heard that little nugget of wisdom about people join the business because of the organization, but they leave because of the manager. And I think that still holds true today. The other interesting thing that you picked up or that you drilled into was around the impact on innovation. And the interesting correlation, I think, between psychological safety and innovation. And you've referenced Drucker and his comment about culture eating strategy for breakfast, but he also famously said that an organization only has two functions, marketing and innovation, and everything else is just cost. Now, if we just drill in on the innovation piece there, without the right culture, organizations will stagnate. And I think your Microsoft example is a very good one to anchor there, because that's essentially what they stopped doing. Became far more bureaucratic, a lot of their performance management was very much around meeting targets, not encouraging that sort of innovation. So that is, I think, a key driver of organizational sustainability and growth. So having the right culture is critically important in terms of driving innovation. The culture ideation process that you spoke about, I think the two things that I wanted to pick up on there is the importance of being intentional as a leader about the culture that you want. And we had this conversation with the group that we tutored on Saturday, that in the absence of a deliberate culture strategy, there will still be a strategy. It'll just be whatever happens, right? And the same applies to culture. So if you're not very, very intentional about it, you'll just end up with whatever behaviors you allow to become entrenched. So that's the first thing. And then secondly, the co-creation piece, I think, is really, really important. And then that takes us back to the 70% failure rate. We know that in any kind of change management or transformation initiative, that being able to take people along for the journey, having that compelling vision that you spoke about is so important. And you only get that when you build out a change initiative, and this even works in a project scenario. If people believe what you're driving towards and are committed and invested and have had an opportunity to participate in defining what that strategy or that culture is going to look like. So that co-creation piece in that framework, I think, is really, really important. And then, of course, realizing also that it is very much a refine and iterate. It's going to be an evolving process. So while you were talking, I also thought, well, key questions perhaps that people should walk away with today is, given the state of the world as it is geopolitically over the last, 15 plus months, the world of work, the operating environment for so many organizations is radically different. And then on top of all of those sort of geopolitical uncertainties, we also throw in the runaway evolution and advancement of AI in the workplace. How are organizations actually responding? And that, I think there needs to be a redefining of organizational culture in terms of how it responds to these things. The culture and the capabilities that organizations need to have today to be able to respond to that with any sort of agility requires a very different skill set, requires a very different conversation to be happening in the workplace. And further to that, because it is a big, it is creating so much uncertainty in the workplace in terms of the response to AI. And again, this was something that we spoke about during our tutorial. The first step that people take, or leadership seems to take, is, well, this is a great opportunity to save on headcount. Let's just slash, like I think Oracle did. I mentioned 30,000 jobs last week or the week before. I think that's a fundamental mistake, because you have all of that talent that could be deployed elsewhere in the business and, move it on to even bigger and greater things. So from a leadership perspective, I think having some out of the box thinking, to use that horrible cliche, around how we respond and how we support the people we currently have in the business to leverage the power of AI for sure, but not just take the simple near-term operational decision to save headcount, but to actually use all of that talent and deploy it in a different way that grows the business into the next, into the next decade. And I don't know where we are on time. I guess the last point that I wanted to make was really to go back to Patagonia and the social anchoring around that shared economy, to go back to the model that you spoke about, shared economy for shared meaning, really, and having that sort of singular focus on building a business around awareness of climate change. And anyone would have said, because this is not a new focus for Patagonia. I don't remember when Patagonia was founded, but that has been their central argument since they were founded. And anyone 20 or 30 years ago would have said you're barking mad, but yet they managed to build a very, very successful business around something that most people would have said is, dare I say, very, very woke before the terminology emerged. But yeah, and yet it has confounded skeptics, I suppose. And that, I think, is a good point to leave the reflection, just to say, having that sort of singular vision, compelling vision that your team can emotionally connect with, is extremely powerful. And I think that is probably the key metric if we're talking about thriving workplaces. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much, Dr. Woods and Pierre-Yves, for that very wonderful presentation. And we'll go straight to the questions for today. We've got a lot of attendees from, all over the world. We have from SA, from Somalia, from Nigeria, from Ethiopia. It's always a global audience, right? The first question is from Ingwen. It says that, could we say organizational culture is core for an organization progress? And if there is misalignment from the workers or top management, it can grave cost the organization.
Absolutely. Let me have a go at this one, and then Pierre, if you have a reflection, by all means, pop in. Yes, is the short answer. And Paul, I think it can feel disingenuous. So your leadership say one thing, live another. Folk who are on the front line and the sort of real heart of the organization experience what you would call dissonance. Okay. And it's real cultural dissonance. And in our view, all it drives is survival behavior. I then do just enough to make sure that I don't get caught out. I don't give any discretionary energy to the organization, and you've got that cultural dissonance. So yes, you want coherence all the way through. Yeah.
All right, thank you.
Sorry, just to add to that, I think humans are incredibly adept at smelling out the rat. And this is a great example. And I think it's supported by the ongoing research that Gallup does around employee engagement. And even the most recent statistics bear this out. Again, about 30% plus minus, fairly consistently, actively disengaged employees. Now, we can quibble about why that is, but I think fundamentally it is because of poor organizational culture. That's the 30% who actively go out of their way to derail the business, right? So those water fountain terrorists, I think, as Jim Collins once called them, the other 40% are in survival mode, George. So you have effectively 70% of the business who's like just coasting along. Now, it doesn't take a genius to work out how much friction there is in the day-to-day operations and how that must surely impact innovation, profitability, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, that sort of disconnect between the two is a fundamental error.
All right, thank you very much. So the follow-up question I would want to ask is, for an employee who finds himself in such organization, right? And is there anything that you can actually do to, you probably do not have the power to make those changes, but you find yourself in this kind of environment. Is there anything you can actually do, or you just allow the course to flow, the river to flow, and hope for something to be better?
It's a great question. And I suppose I'll go back to organizational culture is led from the top. And it can feel disempowering when you desire a different culture and you observe a different culture, if that makes sense. My advice would be is you can own your own team's culture, you can own your own leadership capabilities, you can own your own values and how you show up every day. But truthfully, and and I'm not advocating this per se, unless you've got another job to go to, but sometimes you've actually got to make that decision. You've got to go, I can't relate to what's going on here. It's not coherent with my values. I'm not going to thrive in this environment. And you have to make different decisions. But I would say, own your own development first, the microculture that you can control. Pierre?
All right, thank you very much.
I think you captured that perfectly, George. That's exactly what I would say. But ultimately, this is where people get to that red line and say, okay, I'm out of here. And
Yes.
very often it's because their immediate manager is, one of those
Correct.
toxic folk that they're just not able to deal with any longer.
Indeed.
All right, we have a lot of questions. About time is fast spent, but I would also like to ask one more question from Omolara. She says, how do we correct an organization that the leader's culture is strongly focused on finance and not culture? How do we correct that? I don't know. That's the question from Omolara. I don't know if you can quickly answer that.
Flippantly, you send them this presentation.
Okay.
No, I mean, there is, again, it's somewhat out of your control, right? It's not dissimilar to the previous question. There's that sort of power distance challenge that you can't really materially influence or impact. But the evidence shows very, very clearly that a singular focus only on financial performance undermines greater opportunities for growing revenue and for driving innovation. And the irony is, and I have a few friends who fall into this category, they think this whole culture thing is, all warm and fluffy stuff, and they just couldn't be bothered. But then I also see how they practically have to respond to the high turnover, there's a whole lot of operational fallout from having that mindset that they end up having to deal with. And as a consequence, I don't think they've grown their businesses the way that they could have.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you very much. We have just one more question. I don't know if you can quickly answer that so that we'll close. Says, how does the board assess whether the desired corporate culture is truly embedded at the local county level, particularly in situations where local financial performance is strong? Question is from Frank Trump.
Thank you. And so I'm going to link Frank and Helen's comments together, if that's okay. By looking at the outcomes of the organization. So what do your customers say about the organization? Helen makes the comment that customers will express their frustration at you. And so a key performance indicator is your customer engagement, your financial metrics. The metrics that Pierre just referred to around high staff turnover. Those are the actual metrics that you can apply, Paul. And I think the other thing is whatever gets measured gets managed. And so there needs to be an intentional strategy to measure culture, and it can be done. It absolutely can be done.
All right. Thank you very much, Dr. George. Over to you, John.
Thank you, Dr. Woods and Pierre. I can certainly say that I've done a lot of nodding. I'm not sure, but there's so much that relates, and it's always good listening to you. So thank you very much to both Dr. Woods and Pierre for another very insightful session. And thank you also to everyone that joined us and engaged with us this morning. If you want to know more about BSN's Impact Center for Great Leadership, or if you're interested in a program to further grow the talent of your team or yourself, just put it in the chat and we will contact you. So in next week's episode, we'll hear about what global shocks are teaching us about leadership strategy and resilience. And this is a topic that aligns with our change leadership pillar. Our speaker is Dr. Abiodun Ariona, Group Head of Global Trade and Structured Finance of Providus Bank. So we look forward to seeing you all there. And with all of that said, thank you very much, everyone. Have a great day.